The most effective lies your mind tells you don't feel like lies. They feel like clarity. They feel like you finally understanding yourself. That's not a metaphor. That's a documented mechanism, one that operates below conscious awareness, that shapes what you remember, what you conclude, and what you do. And that presents itself to you as honest thinking. The researcher who first mapped this architecture got famous for the wrong reasons, and then got discredited for the wrong reasons. What he actually found is still running in your head right now. The mind doesn't just process information below awareness. In certain cases, it actively works against awareness, keeping material out of consciousness because bringing it in would be destabilizing. Sigmund Freud called this the dynamic unconscious. Dynamic because it wasn't passive storage, it was active. It pushed back, it distorted, it substituted. It produced symptoms that made no sense until you understood what they were protecting against. His clinical theories built on top of this didn't survive scientific scrutiny. The Oedipus complex as biological universal, gone. Dream content as encrypted wish fulfillment, gone. The hydraulic model of libido as psychic pressure-seeking discharge, gone. But the architecture underneath all of it held. And the research that confirmed it came from researchers who weren't trying to rehabilitate anyone. It came from neuroscientists studying amnesia patients, from cognitive psychologists running forgetting experiments, from social psychologists provoking strangers in laboratories, from a cardiologist tracking the same men across 4 decades. None of them set out to prove Freud right. Several of them would have preferred not to. The first layer is occlusion. The mind hides things. Cognitive psychologist Matthew Erdelyi spent his career taking Freudian claims and submitting them to experimental conditions, not to rehabilitate Freud, to find out what was actually true. What he found on repression was careful and narrow, not Freud's grand theory of repression as the cornerstone of neurosis. Something more specific and more defensible, that people selectively fail to recall material that is threatening to the self, and that this failure is not random forgetting, but a directional process that operates below conscious intention. The experiments weren't proving that repressed memories cause hysteria. They were showing that the mind does something structurally similar to what Freud called repression. Motivated forgetting, directional rather than random, serving a protective function. The direction is always the same, away from threat, away from material that would require something of you if it stayed visible. Neuroscience confirmed the same thing from a completely different direction. Research on the amygdala and implicit emotional memory established that the brain maintains separate systems for conscious and unconscious emotional processing. You can have a fear response to something without remembering why you're afraid of it. The memory of the fear and the emotional response to the trigger can be stored in separate systems. The response fires. The explanation isn't available. Patients with certain kinds of amnesia demonstrate this directly. They develop conditioned emotional responses to things they have no conscious memory of encountering. The fear is real. The memory that would explain it is gone. The emotional system and the narrative system are not the same system. What this means is that you can be genuinely, measurably affected by something you have no access to. The effect is running. The cause is not in view. And nothing in your experience tells you the difference between that and ordinary awareness, because the system doing the hiding is the same system you use to look. This is the feature of the architecture that makes the rest of it possible. If the occlusion were detectable, if there were a gap, a sense of something missing, an awareness that something was being managed, the other mechanisms wouldn't work. The fabrication in the next layer depends on the hiding in this one. You can only construct a convincing false explanation for something if you genuinely don't have access to the real one. The mechanism exists. The Baroque theory built on top of it doesn't have to. The second layer is fabrication. Once something is hidden, the mind invents a reason. This is the one worth watching most carefully because it feels identical to reasoning. Jonathan Haidt's work on moral judgment showed this with particular clarity. People reach moral conclusions in milliseconds through what Haidt called moral intuition, and then produce reasoned arguments that feel like the basis for the conclusion, but are actually constructed in its wake. The argument is the press secretary, not the decision-maker. Haidt demonstrated this by presenting people with moral scenarios designed to produce strong intuitive reactions and then asking them to justify those reactions. When the justification failed, when the person couldn't construct a coherent argument, they didn't revise the conclusion. They searched for a better argument. The conclusion was fixed. The reasoning was a tool deployed in its service. Haidt called this phenomenon moral dumbfounding, the experience of being certain that something is wrong while being unable to say why, and feeling no pressure to revise the certainty in response to the inability. What made this finding difficult to dismiss was its robustness. It replicated across cultures, across age groups, across levels of education. It wasn't a feature of unsophisticated thinking. Highly educated people showed the same pattern. The reasoning process was more elaborate, but it was still serving a conclusion that had already been reached by other means. Timothy Wilson's research on the adaptive unconscious showed the same structure in everyday decisions. Asked to explain their choices, people produce coherent narratives. When those narratives are tested against actual behavior, they don't hold. People are confabulating, not lying, but genuinely without access to the processes that drove what they did. In one series of studies, people chose between identical objects and then explained their preference in detailed, confident terms. Reasons that had no relationship to the actual determinants of the choice, because the actual determinants weren't available to them. They weren't making up an explanation because they were hiding something. They were making up an explanation because they had no other option. The real process happened somewhere they couldn't reach. The person rationalizing isn't aware they're doing it. They experience themselves as thinking clearly, assessing the evidence, arriving at a conclusion. The emotional conclusion came first. The threat was registered, the protection engaged, and the reasoning was assembled afterward to make it presentable. Freud called this rationalization. He was describing the right phenomenon with the wrong explanation. The phenomenon is real. Before we go further, if this is the kind of content you want more of, subscribing takes 2 seconds and it makes a real difference for this channel. Now, back to it. The third layer is redistribution. What can't be owned gets assigned to someone else. Brad Bushman and colleagues documented what experimental psychology calls triggered displaced aggression. People who were provoked and then denied an outlet for that provocation showed significantly more aggression toward a neutral third party than people who hadn't been provoked at all. The provocation was real. The target was arbitrary. The person receiving the aggression had no relationship to its origin. They were simply available at the wrong moment, and the person doing it experienced it as a response to something the neutral party actually did. The displacement doesn't feel like displacement. It feels like a proportionate reaction. Projection works the same way at the level of perception, but operates more continuously. The anger you can't claim becomes other people's aggression. The neediness you can't admit becomes other people's clinginess. The ambition you suppressed becomes everyone else's shallowness. The fear you won't name becomes the thing you criticize most reliably in others. You're not lying. You genuinely perceive it out there. The projection is seamless from the inside. It presents itself as clear observation, not as deflection. There's no internal signal that distinguishes projected perception from accurate perception. Both feel like seeing clearly. Freud described this in case studies. Experimental psychology reproduced it in controlled conditions a century later. The emotional material is real. The redirection is real. The person receiving it had nothing to do with its origin. The fourth layer is where the model stops being psychological and becomes biological. George Vaillant spent 40 years following the same group of men as part of the Harvard study of adult development, one of the longest longitudinal studies of human psychology ever conducted. What he was tracking were defense mechanisms, the specific strategies people use without awareness to manage anxiety, conflict, and emotional pain. The maturity of someone's defensive style at age 30 predicted their physical health, their relationship quality, and their occupational success at age 65, more reliably than socioeconomic status, more reliably than IQ. The people who used what Vaillant called mature defenses, humor, sublimation, altruism, anticipation, aged better by almost every measurable standard. Sublimation in particular, the capacity to take difficult or threatening material and channel it into something productive. Not suppression, not denial, transformation. The material goes somewhere it can be used rather than somewhere it has to be contained. The men who used denial extensively in their 30s showed measurably higher rates of illness in their 50s. The ones who sublimated showed the opposite pattern. The defense style didn't just predict psychological outcomes, it predicted cardiovascular health, immune function, inflammatory markers, longevity. António Damasio's work on patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex showed why this might be the case. That region integrates emotional signals with decision-making. It provides what Damasio called somatic markers, fast signals that flag options before conscious reasoning engages. Patients who lost it retained normal intelligence and normal memory, but couldn't function. Every decision stayed equally weighted. The emotional guidance that normally operates invisibly was gone, and without it, the machinery of reason had nothing to work from. Freud's unconscious had to be doing something to decision-making, not just sitting below it. Damasio gave that claim a mechanism, and what Vaillant's data added was the long tail. The emotional processing strategies you use over decades don't stay psychological. They become the conditions under which your body operates. Chronic activation of stress response systems, which immature defenses tend to produce, because they don't resolve the material, they relocate it, accumulates in ways that eventually show up in tissue. The defense keeps the anxiety out of consciousness. It doesn't keep it out of the body. The fifth layer is the one that makes the previous four invisible. You don't experience these as defenses. You experience them as yourself. The rationalization that feels like clear thinking isn't going to announce itself as rationalization. The displacement that makes you irritable at the wrong person won't come with a label. The partial denial that lets you know something without letting it require action presents itself as perspective, as maturity, as not overreacting. The projection that routes your own material outward feels like accurate social observation. This is what Vaillant's data showed across 40 years. The defense style stabilizes. It becomes the lens. The person relying on projection in their 30s isn't running a conscious strategy. They've built a way of reading the world that routes their own material outward automatically. They don't notice. It feels like accurate perception because for them it has always felt like accurate perception. The same is true of rationalization. People who confabulate consistently aren't aware they're doing something different from thinking. The process is indistinguishable from the inside. The reasoning arrives with the same texture, the same feeling of effort and assessment, the same sense of having looked at the evidence and reached a conclusion. There's no marker that says, this explanation was constructed after the fact. There's no internal timestamp. This is the part of Freud's model that the critics couldn't argue away, because it wasn't a clinical claim. It was a structural one. If the processes that drive behavior operate outside awareness, and if the explanations we construct for our behavior are generated after the fact by a system that doesn't have access to those processes, then self-knowledge becomes a specific kind of problem, not a matter of honesty or effort, but of access. You can be trying as hard as possible to understand yourself and still be working from a confabulated account of what's actually running. The defense style you developed, probably before you had language for it, probably in response to conditions that no longer exist, is still running the same routines. It doesn't update automatically. It doesn't check whether the threat it was built to manage is still present. It manages. That's what it does. And it does it well enough that you experience the output as perception, as reasoning, as personality. You are not a transparent observer of your own mental life. You are a participant in a system that is partly hidden from you, working to protect something, shaping what you see, what you remember, what you conclude, and what you do. What you have access to, if you're paying attention, is the gap. The reaction that's too large for the situation. The reasoning that arrived suspiciously fast. The memory that's oddly absent. The irritation without a clear source. The certainty that feels impenetrable. The topic you reliably avoid. The criticism you return to most often in other people. The explanation that is slightly too coherent, slightly too convenient, slightly too well constructed for what it's supposedly describing. The defense doesn't disappear when you name it, but it loses some of its invisibility, and the invisibility is most of what it has. Those aren't signs of clear thinking. They're the fingerprints of a system working hard to keep something out of view. Freud spent his career cataloging them. He built an empire on the catalog that didn't survive scientific scrutiny. But the catalog itself, the specific patterns, the specific mechanisms, the specific ways the mind protects itself from itself, kept showing up in every serious subsequent investigation of how human psychology actually functions. The field spent decades throwing the catalog away along with the mythology. The word repression became almost unusable in serious research contexts, even as the phenomenon it described kept reappearing in the data under different names: motivated forgetting, confabulation, displaced aggression, somatic conversion. Different vocabularies arriving independently, mapping the same territory. He got the details wrong. He got that right. If you made it this far, thank you. That means a lot. If this video shifted something for you or gave you a different way of seeing how your mind works, consider subscribing. There's more coming, and it's built on the same standard as what you just watched. I'll see you in the next one.